Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Songwriting Tips and Chats with Nick Vulture. And I would like to acknowledge that I am on the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, South Australia, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. In the last episode, which will also happen to be the first episode of this series of Songwriting Tips and Chats, we talked about how to arrive at the theme or the story for your first song or for your next song. And some of the lessons that we talked about that I've learned along the way from how to arrive at the storyline for this song or for your song is, well, some of the tips included to make sure that you're being honest, whether that's an honesty that is purely yours, so the story belongs to you and you're telling the story as it happened, or the story belonged to others, or as we talked about in episode 1, you might be compiling a series of truths. But as long as it's honest, I think to start with, when you're first starting out songwriting, you may remember I mentioned that fictionalizing songs is very difficult. Coming up with fictional stories about fictional characters that didn't happen is a very difficult and tricky thing to do. So I think in the first instance at least, stay honest and stay true to your story, whether or somebody else's story, or as I mentioned, a compilation of truths that you pull into one story with a common thread running between them all. So honesty was lesson number 1. Lesson number 2 in arriving at your story was being uncomfortable. It's okay to be uncomfortable. In fact, it's better to be uncomfortable. It makes for a better song. Write about something that is uncomfortable. And as I mentioned in episode 1, often those stories are stories you won't talk about or can't talk about generally. And that's why we write songs. That's why we write poetry. That's why we write stories, is often because that's a form of expression that you can't use otherwise. And so I've seen some of the greatest songwriters talk about this and listen to them talk about this, that they find it very difficult to answer what songs are about in an interview, for example, because it's in the song and they don't necessarily want to answer it literally. So it's okay to be uncomfortable. Make sure that that you're comfortable in being uncomfortable. And then lastly, we talked about how to even start then on developing your story. And I gave the tip of grabbing a line or a saying that you hear or that you use regularly and building around that. So you may already have the story in mind and you're not sure where to go next with it. So grab a line or a saying. And I gave the example of the song Perfect Storm, my first ever song that I wrote for solo music. And Perfect Storm is a well-used term that I applied to a story. And so the story was sort of sitting there bubbling away in my head, but I needed a grab. I needed something to grab onto. And the line or the saying Perfect Storm ended up being that. And so I think that's a really useful tip, especially starting out. And I would say that I used it initially for probably 6 to 7 out of my first 10 solo songs, that approach of maybe having a theme, but needing a hook and grabbing the line, and then building your storyline around that. So this episode now is really about just taking that to the next step. And I'm going to title this episode Constructing the Song. And I have a sub-theme here, and that sub-theme is flexibility. And so I want to just quickly go back to the word or the saying versus the theme or the topic that I mentioned in episode 1. And I just want to expand on that slightly, very, very briefly. The question may come up in trying to put that into practice. Well, what do I come up with first? What do I do first? Do I grab the saying? Do I grab the saying perfect storm and then build around that? Or do I have a theme or a topic in my head already and then grab a line or a theme to apply to it, to use as maybe, say, a chorus or a key part of a bridge in the song? Or which one do I do first? So I'm here to say that neither one is true and correct. It's okay to do either. So in the case of Perfect Storm, I sort of had a theme there bubbling away in my head. Remember, I hadn't written a solo song at that stage, so I didn't even really know that story in my head was going to end up being a song. But it was a story in the back of my head, in my sort of subconscious, I guess, and was nagging away at me, that topic, that story. But it wasn't until I started thinking about the term perfect storm and what it means that I thought to myself, I could turn that into a song. And as I started writing lyrics and words out, building around the perfect storm concept applied to the relationship topic, then it started to unfold. So it was a bit of a combination of the two, to be honest. And I think that that's okay. You may feel more comfortable, initially at least, doing one or the other, finding the term, finding the word, and then building a story around it. Remember, stay honest, be uncomfortable. If you're going to do that, don't just grab a word or a saying and then just write any old thing that matches. You need to still apply the same principles. Or you may feel more comfortable having the theme, developing the theme, writing, say, verses against the theme, writing out, 4 lines for each verse and writing them out and waiting for a saying or a word or something that someone says that you can then grab for maybe the chorus or, like I said before, maybe the bridge. I'll talk a little bit more about song construction later. But whether you're going to develop up your theme or wait for the grab or the saying or the words, it doesn't really matter. It will eventually be a mixture of the two. But initially you may want to apply one approach to start with. But that's up to you. I think you need to work that one out for yourself and have a go at it. It's okay if it's not fantastic to start with. Okay, my second part of constructing the song that I want to talk about here is the age-old question, what comes first, the lyrics or the music or the rhythm? And once again, I'm afraid to say that there is no right or wrong. It would be much simpler if there was, but there's not. And so I don't think it really matters, to be honest. I used to answer that question when I was writing garage punk music only. I used to answer that question with, well, usually I come up with a rhythm first. I hear a rhythm in another song and then I play around with that and I change it and I get something that I like out of it that ends up not sounding anything like the rhythm that inspired me to start with. And then eventually I start putting some lyrics in it that sound good. And for garage punk music, that's fine. It's fine to do that because what you're singing about isn't really the issue in most cases, or certainly not in the case of my band that I was in. But when you're doing acoustic, singer-songwriter, folk, whatever version of singer-songwriter you may do, country, western, Americana, etc., you need to think more carefully about the lyrics than that. So it's not a clear-cut case of, well, just come up with your rhythm first, come up with your tune first, and then start writing down lyrics against the lessons that we've talked about already. It's okay to actually come up with your theme, start writing out lyrics, not really having a tune in your head, and just sitting on them. And one day, a rhythm or a musical piece may inspire you from somewhere. It may be something you've heard that someone else has done. It might be something you've heard on television, on YouTube, whatever it might be. You may hear something that inspires you, and then you sit down and play around with it. There are so many times that's happened to me. I've heard a rhythm somewhere else. I've sat down and played with what I think is that rhythm, and then I play around with it and I change it, and it ends up sounding almost completely different to what started me off on that track. And that's important because I don't want to copy or mimic that rhythm anyway. But it's just a good way of getting started, and you start with that and then play around with it and come up with something different that you like. But it just gets you started, gets the ball rolling. And so you may already have a set of lyrics there, and you're just sitting and waiting for that moment when you arrive at a rhythm. And then what do you need to do? You need to somehow make sure that your lyrics work into that rhythm. So inevitably, your lyrics will change to make that work. They need to change. That's the way it needs to work. You need to make sure that if you are going to apply pre-written lyrics to a new rhythm, don't be too stubborn about it. Really, it's not a good way to go. I've seen it happen before, and it sounds forced, and it just doesn't make for a good song when someone's crammed their lyrics in because they refuse to change them. It just doesn't work. So I can almost, me personally, I can almost tell when that's happened, when a songwriter has done that, when they've pre-written the lyrics and then refused to change them to match the rhythm that they've come up with. And I just think that that's stubbornness, really. So make sure if you do write your lyrics out first, or you have a bunch of lyrics, that when you do come up with the rhythm, you need to be flexible. Again, constructing the song is about flexibility. Whether you're coming up with the saying first or the theme first and then the saying, and then whether you're coming up with the lyrics around that saying and that theme, or whether you're coming up with the rhythm and then lastly developing the lyrics, you're just going to need to be flexible. But again, you might just want to try one approach to start with when you're first starting your songwriting. So maybe go, choose one or the other. Maybe just choose one and have a go. So maybe say to yourself, well, I'm going to write out some lyrics first against this theme that I've come up with based on what I've learnt in episode 1. I've come up with this theme. And if we were to apply a real-life example to that, the most common theme, I think, in any singer-songwriter repertoire, no matter who you're talking about, is the breakup song. The breakup song is the number one theme for music. It doesn't even need to be singer-songwriter. It can be a pop song, it can be a garage song, it could be a punk song, it could be a rock and roll song. The breakup song, let's face it, is the most common theme. So if you were to say choose a breakup theme, now that's a bit naff maybe, but let's just run with it as an example. And then you had a saying. So I come up with an example saying of, the old saying, it never rains but it pours. So let's make that the example saying, it never rains but it pours. And it's a breakup song. Okay, that's enough to get you started. You can sit down and write 4 lines of a verse, and then you can write 2 lines if we're going to go with a very simple songwriting construction, 4 lines of a verse, 2 lines of a chorus, 4 lines of another verse, 2 lines of a chorus. Usually the chorus is repeated or very similar, and then 4 lines of another verse, and then 2 lines of another chorus. That's a very, very basic song construction, right? Quite common. very basic, but a good way to get started. A bridge, I mentioned before, a bridge is something that you do to change up that pattern. And you usually only do it once. I mean, you can have a couple of bridges in a song, but it really is best used to minimal effect, so usually once. And I would usually put it maybe after the second chorus, and it's like, so for example, if you've done 4 lines of a verse, 2 lines of a chorus, and you've done that twice, it might be time to break it up with a bridge. So you might do something that's in a different key or a different set of chords, or maybe even just one chord that's not the same as the other ones you were playing, and you sing 3 lines, for example, or 1 line. So it breaks up the pattern. And the reason that you do that is to grab the attention keep the attention of the listener, so they're not falling asleep to your existing pattern. So really, I don't want to go too much further today in this episode. I just want to mention the concept of constructing the song and flexibility within that. Whether it be your saying versus your theme, whichever one comes first, it doesn't matter too much, but maybe try one. Whether you come up with the lyrics first or the music or the rhythm, again, it doesn't matter too much, but maybe just try one and have a go at it. Write it out, write it on a bit of paper, sit on those lyrics, sit on that rhythm for a while and just play with it, and don't finish the song straight away. Don't ever think that a song's finished just because you've written it out and played it and it sounds okay. Don't sit on it a bit. You might come up with something different or even better. So just sit on it and play with it a little bit later. So that's it for now. I will continue to talk about the construction of a song in the next episode, where I will also invite a special guest to come and talk about how they construct songs and how they conceive of ideas and put it all to music. Also, remember, if you want to do this more and you want to get more detail about songwriting, to drop me a line on nickvulture.com. That's my website. You can contact me through nickvulture.com and we can work out a special one-on-one arrangement songwriting lesson. Yeah, and we can do more one-on-one tutoring and support around that through nickvulture.com. And also, please remember to give me a follow or a like, depending on what platform you're listening to this on, whether it be through YouTube or Spotify or Podbean or Apple Music or whatever it may be. Please give me a follow and a like. That would be great as well. Speak soon.